Okay, I'm also Kelly Shoker. So Charlotte Dune is my pen name. Kelly Shoker is my real name. And I started with a pen name because the publisher that I was initially with thought Shoker was like too weird of a name. It didn't fit into like the genre I was writing. So we focus grouped and came up with the Charlotte Dune name. But you'll find my film work under my real name, Kelly Shoker. And he already said what I do. So I want to talk a little bit about my approach to creative work, because while I have done government work, entrepreneurial work, run businesses, I've also been a lifelong artist. And I think this is CreativeZen is the perfect name for this, because my zen is literally through being creative. I think if I didn't have these creative outlets, I would go cuckoo bananas. So the creativity keeps me in check. And the type of I think there's two types of creatives. There's what I call cathedral creatives and what I call chronic creators. And the cathedral creatives are the ones that work on like big, massive projects that take years and years to execute, like Sistine Chapel types of projects. And the chronic creators are more like daily, like throw it on the wall, try this, try that, experiment with this. And I'm definitely in the later category. And I find that I have joyous experiments with creativity. And then every now and then I'll have terrible, obsessive creative experiences where I get way too obsessed with a project and it's like drives me mad instead of giving me creative zen. And, you know, I think a lot about these different kind of, you know, I'm definitely a sudden creative. So I don't know if that resonates, but I do think that my type of creativity, and you'll see as we go through this, is a very experimental type of creativity. I've worked in almost every medium that you can think of besides like ceramics and paint. I've done many things. So I also decided after seeing the CreativeZen presentation last week, which was with a fabric artist, she showed her creative arc from childhood to present, and I decided this was actually very valuable because her early work really, you could tell it was the same person, and I was like, that's crazy that it's like the same person. And I thought about my own work, and you guys will see, I think the themes have been going strong since like third grade. So I grew up in a rural area in rural Appalachia. My parents were hippies, and they decided to build a geodesic dome in the middle of the forest, which I now run as the Airbnb. My dad was a musician, and he was also a commercial artist and an animator, and he drove really far to another town to have his commercial art business. So I was in some of his commercials and his magazines. I was always a big reader, but I grew up it was a very isolated childhood because there were no other kids near us besides my brother and another girl whose parents had bought the land with my parents, and we were living like communally. But there was nobody else around us. I had to drive like 40 minutes to go to my friend's house sometimes, you know. So, but I loved photography also. And we didn't have YouTube back then, as you know. My biggest influences were just the people around me. My dad and he was in so many different bands, his musical stuff. My grandmother, who was a big singer, and my grandfather, who was a very successful businessman who lived in Richmond, Virginia. And we would go see him sometimes, and he was really into the opera. He had survived the Holocaust, and he was just like, I love opera now, and we're going to go to every opera. So I got exposed to these like opera and theater productions, which was probably very, very unusual for a person living in rural Appalachia. So my early work as a adolescent, like before, while I was living at home, I did a lot of writing, copious amounts of writing. And this is my first book that I wrote in 4th grade. So I was one of these that was like constantly writing at a young age. I filled up tons and tons of notebooks, which my mom lovingly kept, with short stories. I would write fantasy short stories. And then as I got older in high school, I wrote extremely dark, disturbing, emo poetry that my parents probably should have sent me to a psychologist had they read it. And I worked at Burger King at the drive-thru, and I would take my Burger King money, drive to the nearest town, and I would have Kinkos bind up my poetry books, and then I would hide them in a duffel bag in my closet and hope that no one would find them. Again, obsession, compulsion, all these things. I also did some early film work, which I wish I had to show you, but I got robbed at one point when I lived in Uganda, and so I lost a lot of my early video work, but I made fake newscasts. I was fake news before fake news. I made fake commercials for like imaginary products, and I experimented a lot with Polaroids and paper collage. And I share this very emo early triptych that I made because I looked at it and I was like, wow, this doesn't look that different from the photography that I later made when I was like 35. So yeah, I also did tons of productions, which my parents lovingly drove me to the next town. I was in dance. This was one of the choir directors. I had a dance group that I coordinated. So this was my dance troupe. We made bizarre modern dances and performed them, and we were called Those Dancers. And I did Grease. I did a bunch of theater. I was Rizzo in Grease, did a bunch of theater productions. I thought about my primary influences, and in this pre-YouTube era, I had my dad's records, loved Frank Zappa, random books from the library, and I was really into music. And every now and then, I would manage to watch a totally inappropriate movie, and I loved that also. That fueled my creativity. And in this early phase, I just also had a lot of luck that my parents were willing and able to drive me to places, and then that I also got a full scholarship to university. So the next phase was moving to Richmond. I went to Virginia Commonwealth University and also did a joint program that I coordinated myself because I was doing a bachelor's of interdisciplinary study because I could never decide what I wanted to do. I just wanted to do everything in like every medium. And I also went to UC Berkeley during this time. But I was so lucky. Again, I wanted to share some of my influences. When I was at UC Berkeley, I got to be the random roommate of a musician named EMA, who later went on to tour with Depeche Mode. She did gallery shows at the MoMA, and we worked together, and she really influenced my work, as did this artist, Holly Lester, who would make clothes out of objects. Like she would make dresses out of soy sauce packets, or like t-shirts out of ketchup packets, like all these crazy things. And also this fella who was a jazz musician and a jazz composer, and we had a relationship. And so I got really into jazz, and just this influenced my later work as well. And I started thinking about a house versus a city, and how I wanted my creative work to be a city and not just like a single house. Again, going back to that idea of like chronic, frenetic, different work versus like these big singular works. So I was just always creating stuff. So in camera, I did more Polaroid work. I made a ridiculous album and edited music videos, and we used to edit, like, I didn't have editing software, so I would edit in the camera by like shooting, pausing, move people, like directing in camera. I think you probably did this as kids with like, well, I don't know if kids do this anymore. But there's my ridiculous album I made. And I also surrounded myself with musicians. I experimented a lot. I was experimenting with all the drugs except heroin, basically. I was in a polyamorous relationship with all these musicians at the same time. I was having an absolute amazing time, and it was fueling all my creative energy. And around this time, I also made this experimental film with the artist that I showed you before, EMA, and it's screened in galleries, it's screened at experimental film festivals, it showed all over the place. I'll see if I can play like a little clip of it. It was a meditation. You can watch the whole thing on my Vimeo, but we have it behind a paywall because it was like a gallery piece, and her and I occasionally show it places. So I'll see if this clip plays, so you get an idea of the kind of stuff I was shooting back then and editing in college. Oh, I guess we don't have sound, do we?
Maybe it's on mute?
But I was doing very strange performance work. I was doing a lot of body work. I was doing crazy stuff. and learning how to edit and like, absorbing all this different art. Another like huge influence during this time was just the indie video stores. And this guy named Barry who would drive out to our house in rural Virginia from the city that my dad knew from AOL internet groups. And he would bring us recorded videos of MTV because literally we got no channels like when I was growing up and like out in the sticks in like rural 1990s like Western Virginia. I lived like 15 minutes from the West Virginia border. So really like all my early media, and even in college, we didn't really have internet the way we have it now. So I just went to these indie video stores and rented like every weird video they had because I was so into strange videos. And then also while I was in university, I got offered a study abroad to Mexico, and I was so excited because my scholarship was going to pay for it, and it was in the arts. And so I signed up, and then a few weeks later they told me, oh no, actually that trip's not happening anymore, but you can go to Uganda and Kenya. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know where that is. Went and found it on a map, and I got to go to Uganda to this women's conference for a week, and then later to Kenya for like a month. And that was a very transformative experience that shaped the entire rest of my life. Also, during that university time, I got to take a class called Fiction to Film, where we read novels and then watched the movie adaptations and like read the scripts. So that was also very, I found myself all throughout my life going back to that class and thinking about, my novels in a cinematic way. So, and a lot of people do tell me now my novels, they're always like, you should make this into a movie. We want to see this as a movie. And I'm like, one day. So if you know any Netflix people, send them my way. So like anybody, I thought, what am I going to do after university? I'm going to move to Uganda. Because I loved it so much there. Like when I went there, I was like, this is the place for me. I was only there for a week, but I was like, this is it. The weather was great. The people were amazing. It was just such a fascinating, exciting place. I had also had a rather tragic event. I had gotten raped by a family friend. So I just wanted to be as far away from where I grew up as possible. And like, for whatever reason back then, I didn't tell anybody. I just kept it to myself. I, repressed everything. And I was like, I'll just run away to Uganda instead of talking about this. And so that's what I did. And when I had gone to that conference, I had met a woman who ran an NGO. So I coordinated to do like a fellowship with her, and I ended up working with 6 NGOs in Uganda for I was supposed to stay for 6 weeks, I think. I ended up staying for 7 years. But I also, because I was repressing all that trauma, I also went down a path in Uganda that I would have never expected had you told me before I left. And that was drug addiction. So Uganda at that time was coming out of wars. This was in the early 2000s. It was a very jubilant, exciting time. Everybody was just getting cell phones, but it was also like boogie nights in the city. And everyone was doing cocaine. It was very casual. Everyone was partying, nightclubs, drinking all day, no laws. And that's kind of what I ended up falling into. And this was a club I used to go to all the time there. But I was still working, so I was really living this double life. I married the son of basically of a Supreme Court, like the equivalent of a Supreme Court justice. His family was part of the royal Baganda family, a very prominent 1% family I married in. But I also got to meet some amazing journalists. This is Glenna Gordon, who takes photos for the New York Times. So I really wasn't doing that much art during this time period. But I was shooting a lot of video, which I'll later use. But it was a wild time. I also just started drinking a lot, I think to cope with the stress of working in slums, but also living this double life and getting addicted to cocaine. I also kept a blog. Of course, did not write about my addiction on the blog, just kept it moving on the blog. But the blog actually became pretty popular. It was on LiveJournal, and I had a lot of readers. And I would go to the internet cafe because I didn't have my own internet, And I would write this blog and I would kind of document my trip, and I would also do fundraising videos and raise money for these 6 women's organizations that I was working for. Then had a baby, actually, and married into this prominent family. And a lot of people ask me, how did you become a diplomat? Well, the answer, I met a guy at a bar. And he was like, we really need someone to come work at the embassy who's American, because you have to have a top secret clearance, and we need somebody who really knows the Ugandan context. And I said, oh, that's me. And yes, please, I'd like to make a lot more money than I'm making like with these NGOs. So I sold out to Uncle Sam. And after Uganda, so I worked in Uganda at the embassy for a while as a contractor, then became an official hire. My husband was also promised a job at the embassy that I was going to, and I got transferred to Cameroon. So this was the next phase that would be a time of me starting to like have a reckoning with all the bad behavior I'd been doing, all the partying, all the drugs, trying to, you know, just be a good mom and a good worker and not like turn to these vices. But I still hadn't dealt with any of the trauma that I'd experienced. I'd still seen so much stuff. I'd gotten robbed in Uganda twice. I'd had now quite a lot of abuse. I had seen, you know, I had seen dead bodies on the street. I had seen things that would, you know, I had seen so much poverty. It was like my brain could not adjust. But when I moved to Cameroon, I did get a chance to work with some more amazing people. I put a heart around Ophir because he's the most amazing person I've ever met. If you get a chance to look up his work, Ophir Driori. So this was my boss at the State Department. He let me make films while I was there. He let me author cables that later got released in WikiLeaks. He let me do all kinds of reports, and he let me perform different places. So it was kind of like a return to, you know, I was able to stop most of my bad behavior, though I was still drinking, but I got to do some more performing. Ophir ran a wildlife trafficking NGO, and he would fight corruption. He would fight wildlife trafficking, but he was also writing a book. He was writing a memoir, and he had a deal with a publisher in New York. And so he was the first person who really encouraged me, you know, like, you have a crazy story. You married into the 1% of Uganda as like a white girl from rural Appalachia. You got to write a book too. And so he was the one that really encouraged me to start writing my first book, which is called Kampala Sunsets, which I'll talk more about later. And then I also got to make a film for the embassy. And this is Frank Hamini. And he was a Cameroonian filmmaker who had made a documentary about the banana industry in Cameroon and the exploitation. And he worked with me. Really, it was his film, and I was like the producer, and he was the director. And we made a film for the consular section of the embassy about fighting corruption. And I got to work with this musician, General Balsero, who was risking so much. He inspired me so much because he would get arrested all the time by the Cameroonian police, but he would just keep performing and like find a way out of jail and like go perform again. And he you know, it was an oppressive dictatorship, but he was fighting it. And then there was a fellow that ran a library where we would also perform and show films. And then I also got to work with this fellow, Ryan, who was a documentary filmmaker. And he later became Lady Maga, who is like a huge influencer now and has had a documentary made about him. But maybe you guys know Lady Maga. But I also got to see his filmmaking and learn how he put his films together. He made a film called Green Eyes in Africa, which is a beautiful film about the mistreatment of children in Cameroon. So I'm going to show you a short clip of this film that I made for the U.S. Embassy. In my marriage into that other Ugandan family. But this little project gave me like the filmmaker bug because I watched how Frank directed the actors. It was like a very Nollywood style production. I saw how he set up the lights. I saw, you know, we workshopped the script. These were just embassy employees that are acting. They're not professional actors, so it's so wonky. But this thing is still, I think, playing in the embassy consular section in Cameroon because basically they had a policy back then I think it's still in place that if your father was caught doing corruption, your father and mother was caught doing corruption, you would lose your student visa. And so many of the wealthy Cameroonian people had sent their kids to the US. So it was like, that was what the film was about a dad who was being corrupt, and then the kids would lose their visas. So, but yeah, it gave me the filmmaking bug. Oh wait, I gotta get out of this. Let's see if I can shut this here. Can you help me, Mike? And yeah, so I got the filmmaking bug from this. And then can we go to present mode? Present. Okay.
Here, let me get the mouse to set it up.
Here. Sorry, guys. Technical difficulties. Oh, I think, present full screen.
Yep.
And you can jump to the next one.
Next one.
And then I'll take it. Thank you. Okay, and I have to be aware of my time because I'll talk forever. But by the time I was getting ready to leave Cameroon, I had another tragedy in my life, two more tragedies actually. That was that my daughter had a series of very violent seizures, and she lost consciousness. They think it was from an infection that she got in Cameroon. And so we had to get medevaced, and they told me she might have brain damage. It was like a whole terrible thing. And so I had planned to keep working in Africa. Basically, I wanted to do that forever. I was very comfortable working in Africa, but that sent me back to a first world country because she needed like more medical care than an African country would be suitable for. And the State Department like pulled her medical clearance and sent us to Canada. And then I also had the tragedy that 3 different women came forward and told me that my husband had either raped or attempted to rape them. So this was devastating, as you can imagine. I can talk about it now, but for years I couldn't even talk about it. So I was still suppressing so much of everything, and basically also started dabbling with cocaine again just to, cope. And then I had a very close friend die in a plane crash right after we had been doing cocaine, and he was the one responsible for this small private plane. And that was a wake-up call for me, and I tried to get sober again. And I got sent to Canada. But my sobriety did not really work. I was able to mostly stop the cocaine, but I continued to have a lot of problems with alcohol. And I call Canada my goldfish years because I was so sad about my divorce. I was so sad about having to leave Africa that when my daughter and my marriage had broken up, I was like, how can I stay with someone who's like been violent to me at times? And so I believed the accusations because I was like, yeah, I can see that happening. And at first he went to rehab. We did 2 rounds of rehab. After the 3rd round of rehab, I was like, you know what, I can't stay. Like, I've done all I can do to try to make this marriage work. But I was so sad about the divorce and so sad about these accusations and everything that after I put my daughter to bed, I would just sit in my living room and drink whiskey and eat Pepperidge Farm goldfish crackers, basically until I like blacked out, like every night. So I don't know how I think this was a clip I threw in about the seizure stuff. We're gonna skip that. And so at some point while I was in Canada, I was like, I have got to get a grip on the way I feel. Like, I can't keep going to work hungover, feeling sad, wanting to cry every single day at my desk. And so I turned back to my creative writing, documenting. I really hadn't been doing much creative writing before. I would like jot down ideas for this book that Ophir thought I should write. And I was like, you know what, I'm gonna actually write that book. So I sat down and actually, you know what, I think I will play. I think this clip isn't actually what I thought. Will you help me? I want to show you guys what I did for the process of the first book. So I decided I'm going to write a memoir about what happened. And I sat down and started compiling everything. So 3108. It's great when you make a movie about your life because then you're like, oh, I can find that really easily.
Doesn't work out because of cultural differences or racist ideas about black fathers.
Oh, and I was feeling a lot of shame about the marriage ending.
But keeping everything a secret is taking a toll on me. I start writing about the past as a way to cope with the present. I slowly write out everything I can remember about my time in Africa. It's like I'm looking for clues in my own memory to try and figure out how I managed to go so wrong. I want writing to have this cathartic effect, where when I get to the present, I will be done with the past, but I can barely finish reading what I've written. I decide that in order to move on from the past, I need to start talking to people about the real reasons Paul and I separated and my worries for Isis in the future.
Isis's relationship with her father.
You can stop it now. So I embarked on this writing project, just documenting everything that had happened, really as an investigative process to like try and figure out what went wrong. Like I really was blaming myself a lot at this time. So this became like a creative obsession. And I don't think that's particularly healthy. I wouldn't recommend writing about a traumatic situation while you're still in the traumatic situation, but that is what I did. And while this was all going on, though, I was working for the embassy and living, again, a double life, being sad at night, having a very glamorous job during the day. I was liaisoning with the TIFF. I was working as like the assistant to the consul general, and they were doing a lot with the Toronto International Film Festival and all the movie stars. I got to sit next to Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie at the premiere of Moneyball. You know, it was this fabulous time I was having on the outside. My parents were still proud of me. They didn't even realize everything that had happened with the relationship. And wait, let me go back one. Oh no, I'll just stay here. Oops, can I go back? So I was like, once again, it was time for me to transfer posts eventually because the State Department moves you every 2 years. But by this time I was so messed up, and I had some friends in Canada that I had known from Uganda, and we were all very close. And I was like, I can't leave. So I talked to a friend, one of the journalists that you saw, she was actually an ad exec that you saw in one of the other slides from Uganda. And she was like, why don't you see if you can do a sabbatical and just stay in Canada? Because like you're obviously you're not in good shape to leave. And I had also, like, once you're kind of messed up, you attract people that want to take advantage of messed up people. So I also attracted another abusive guy. So I had fallen into another abusive relationship, unfortunately. But I really wanted to stay in Canada. So I applied last minute for a sabbatical. It got granted. I applied to do a master's in fine arts at a place called Ryerson, which I only really applied to because no writing programs were available. What I wanted to do was writing, but I convinced the State Department, hey, I've been making movies, I've been doing public relations, like, can I also get a media production degree and then I'll make more commercials and media for the State Department? They said yes, and then the director of the program just happened to be obsessed with American politics. And so he was like, oh my God, you work for the State Department. And they gave me a full ride again. And they let me in despite the fact that the deadline was already over. So I got into this Master's of Fine Arts in Documentary Media program. And that was incredibly healing and incredibly life-changing. And this is when things started to like turn around for me a little bit. Even though being a diplomat seems like it would be good, it was really not working for me at all. I got to take classes with Adam Agoyan, who is an Academy Award nominated filmmaker. I got to work very closely with Manfred Becker, who has edited hundreds of documentaries. And they really encouraged me, both of them really encouraged me to make a film work about my story, because I had started we had to make a film as part of the master's, and I had started making a film about female venture capitalists in Canada. And I was interviewing these female venture capitalists, and they were like, why are you making this like boring commercial thing when you have this crazy story? Like, why don't you make your own crazy story? And eventually I did. I also, in my classes, I also got to really get inspired by Zila Liepens, who is a photographer, because we had still photographers and filmmakers in the program. She films soldiers along the Russian and Latvian border. Michelle Pearson Clark, who is a Trinidadian video installation artist, and Min Suk Lee, who has made tons of documentaries and is an environmentalist. And then Min Suk Lee, because she knew my story and she had been seeing this project, which you saw clips of, that I was really working on just for myself. I don't have it released, about my story. And also Vince, who was just an amazing photographer, a cathedral type photographer. Oh, more stuff. Got to get to the next phase. Skipping through this. So Min Suk was like, hey, I met this other girl who also is making a story about sexual assault. You guys should work together and make a movie. And so I met the girl, Mandy Gray, who's an activist and also was going through a sex assault trial. And we made a movie documenting her story together. And that movie went on to premiere at Hot Docs, which is like the world's biggest documentary film festival, basically. Won a Hollywood Documentary First Time Director Award. The score won an award. During that time period, I did video art installations. I made so many short films, it would be like too many to show. Here's some of the really early stuff I did. I was also doing commercials. I did a Dragon's Den thing where I met Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful, which was really fun. He's so nice in person, like the nicest person you could ever meet. I worked with some autistic comedians. I just did like all kinds of random stuff. I did this project which got screened in some galleries. It was like a gallery installation, and this was an experimental film. And this was a narrative feature, a short film that I made with another, she's actually like a Netflix star now. She's been in a bunch of shows. One of my gallery installations that I did, and this was pretty personal too, is I did a FOIA request on myself. So that's a Freedom of Information Act, because I wanted to see the depth of surveillance the State Department had been doing on employees, and it was very shocking. So I put this into a piece. At the time, I fell for the sound guy and got a happy new relationship with Aga, who I now do books with. And I'm going to play you guys the trailer of Slut or Nut, which was my biggest film project that got into all these different festivals. It's now screened literally all over the world. Like, people in Europe really like it. It got translated into German. It screens every year at this like feminist festival in Austria. It screens at a lot of, I get royalty checks still. I sold it to a British distribution agent and to a Canadian educational distribution company. And I also did crowdfunding for it. So we raised like $40,000 on Indiegogo and also from like various donors to produce the film. So that was also a very valuable experience. And we worked with like local media, like the local news, to try and get more publicity for the crowdfunding. So I learned a lot more about like real PR and real, film distribution and the film festival circuit through this project. I don't know if you guys noticed, but if any of you follow the YouTube creator Theory of Everything, Kurt Jumangel, he played the rapist in the movie. Now I think he has 600,000 followers on YouTube. He's great. I really like his work. And Mandy Gray's work as well. And she just released a new book that was published by a major Canadian publisher, because after this all happened and after the person was convicted of raping her, she was sued for supporting another victim of rape and for tweeting about it. So she got sued for like slander by a prominent Canadian. And so she wrote a book about how men will sue women for slander after they report sexual assault and rape, and how this is an obstacle to women reporting. And we made a lot of content for the Indiegogo campaign, so this was a great experience too. And then after the film, we got a grant from a Canadian organization, CUPE, which is like a Canadian union. We got a grant to make a podcast about the legal challenges of reporting sexual assault in Canada. So that was a fun experience to produce that podcast too. But then, I feel like I could have stayed in Canada. I was very embedded in the film industry. I knew so many filmmakers. I could have stayed and had a wonderful time. But my partner, the sound guy, Aga, was in danger of losing his Canadian green card that he had won in the diversity lottery. So we decided, okay, we don't want you to lose his American green card. So we decided we have to move to America so that he could keep his green card. So we moved to America. And I also wanted to be closer to my family at my time. So we'll just speed through this I got a publishing deal during the pandemic to write for my memoir, which I had written, and then the publishing deal got pulled due to COVID and never got picked up again, and it was a very frustrating situation. So then I did ayahuasca to cope with and just to heal, and I think that brought me even more healing from everything that had happened. And I also did rapid resolution therapy, and now I feel, great, guys. Proof that no matter what kind of bad stuff happens, even if your husband gets accused of rape and does crazy stuff and your daughter loses her father, you can go on and be a very happy, positive person, creative person. And then I wrote 2 novels in a series. They are pure fiction. They're magical realism, Cactus Friends and Mushroom Honeymoon. And this one really came to me in the ayahuasca ceremony. The ayahuasca gave it to me. I wasn't planning on writing a novel like this, but I had been taking writing classes and writing, and I had been writing for many, many years and writing stories, so it wasn't completely out of left field for me to write a novel. And then I was with a small press initially, and then I decided that what were they really doing for me that I wasn't able to do for myself and take a larger royalty. So now I self-publish these, which I really like. I also did a photo and poetry book with a local photographer, Peter Nolan, kind of exploring my feelings during the pandemic, which is up here. I helped my partner and some other people do some self-publishing, and I did this family project with another photographer, so some collaborations. Then I was writing a short story, and it turned into another novel, and I wrote a dystopian Christmas book, which I think people like the best out of all my books. And they're up here. And I also do a blog, and now I'm wrapping it up quick. And if you would like to subscribe, I send a thoughtful essay once a week. You can find it at charlottedune.com. And I have a paid version. If you guys subscribe today, I'll just add you to the paid version for free. A thoughtful essay once a week. I try to write about things that would be of interest to a larger audience, but weaving in some personal insights or things that I'm finding that are interesting. Sometimes I throw in some humor. And my final thoughts are just the most important thing now to me with my art is to keep it fun. I did this fun little project with my artist friend Rashonda, who also makes amazing art, and our painter friend Kim. And, I try to keep more organized because I wasn't doing that in the beginning. And I try to keep it social, though it's great to get out and go to galleries and see stuff. And I try to do streaks too. I did a lot of nature photography when I first moved to Florida. I still do a lot of experimenting, just taking photos in my house, taking photos with my daughter, doing weird stuff. This was a Valentine's Day photo shoot I did a few years ago. My partner and I said, instead of going on a date, we'll just do a photo shoot. And so, questions? Sorry, apparently I can talk a lot early in the morning. I'm also a night owl. And I brought lots of books because I have extras, and you guys used your valuable morning time, got up early and came out and listened to me. So please, I'm not even selling these. Just take whatever you would like. And all I ask is if you want to leave a review, that would be great.